Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our next to the last Torch Club meeting of this season, a little extended from last year. We have June, we have one more coming up in July, and it is utterly fantastic when I figure we started out in February, our first time back from COVID, and I think we could fill one table, and here we've got the whole place full. I think that is absolutely great, and no mask going on, so great thing to do. So, what I wanted is we have an army of guests here tonight. So, if one table, you could, John, start with who your guests are.
Pleased to introduce to all of you my guests, Lucy Sieber Matthews and Randy Sieber, dear friends. Son Tom Allen, practicing lawyer here in Kalamazoo. And Jeff, one thing I love about Torch is you learn things. And Jeff told me that there are basically two kinds of women.
I told you not to tell them.
There are attractive women, those are the ones that I notice, and there are charming women, those are the ones that notice me. So I'd like you to also meet the most attractive and charming woman I know, my wife, Kyle Kessler.
I think I better change his introduction, but anyway. And no one over here, just a bunch of argumentative doctors and lawyers. Okay, so they're out. At what, Barbara?
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to introduce my guest, Ken Norris, who hopefully will join us in September.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I'd like to reintroduce my wife, Linda, who's here. We have a dress rehearsal because we're going to Chicago next week. So we thought she'd get out and get dressed and see what the world looks like.
Practice. Practice getting dressed.
Good evening, and I want to introduce my guest, Tom Lucking. Tom and I fortuitously met each other at a jail about 15 years ago, where I was beginning to work as a volunteer, and Tom decided to join the crowd. Actually, he'd been working up in Allegan, yeah, for longer than I had in terms of volunteering. So that's how we got to know each other, and Tom has done a lot of consulting with various groups and continues to.
I'd like to reintroduce my wife, Cynthia. She's been here before, and she is joining us again tonight. And thank you.
I'd like to introduce my friend, Jennifer Afton. She's my neighbor and my partner in crime.
Well, thank you, all of you. There's only one other thing before we start the program, and that is I heard a mention of a possible new member. We just had a board of directors meeting at 4:30 this afternoon, and we were talking about a proposal which was approved. Is this working? Okay. That was approved, and that is we want to offer an incentive to all of our existing members to get new members in and signed up and become regular members. And what we approved at the board was a 50% reduction in your annual dues for 1 year if you get a new member to come in. And it's not just as a guest. They have to come in and sign in and become an actual paying dues member. And we thought the benefit of getting these new members outweighs the cost of giving up the 6 months of tuition, or if you want to call it tuition or dues, from everybody. Okay? So I hope that is a workable incentive for everybody here to try and get us some new members, because we certainly need some new members. A maximum of 2, okay? 2 new members. I don't agree with that, but that's okay. If you can bring 10 members, I'm going to be really happy. But maybe do it 1 year after another. But I think that's going to work for us. I think we got a very interesting presentation coming up tonight, but it's going to be brought by some guy who's originally a foreigner. He's from Pennsylvania. Apparently went to law school, because that's pretty good, because he has been actually presenting himself as a lawyer for the last 40 years. Is that right? Yeah. And he's managed to get away with it. And he notes in a profile he wrote that he was the father of 3 great children, one of whom he brought with him today. All right. He said languages spoken, English flawed, Spanish rusty to the point of corrosion. Okay. And he goes to his children and grandchildren, but and we know he's big in golf. That's for doggone sure. And people that he would want to have dinner with are his children, Arnie Palmer and Thomas Jefferson. Well, you're having dinner with me. I'm Thomas Jefferson Murphy. Okay. Who's buying? I want to know. And he's written a book, and he wants to write another one. But in any case, the thing that I found very odd is, can you bark for us? Because you said in your thing that you were a mongrel. It's written right here. Because what is your family lineage? Mongrel. His father was Irish immigrant ancestor, arrived in 1743, Fort Worth, Washington, and the mother was English. Frankly, I've got both English and Irish background, and we are hybrids, not mongrels.
All right. All right.
I give you John Allen.
Good enough. Thank you very much, Jeff. Am I properly on sound here? Good. How do I fire up the projector? Like the candle? There we go. All right. Thank you very much. And, you want to kill some of those lights so I can get along with them? There you go. It's coming up. It was sleepy. Yeah, it's a small screen. You won't be able to see most of it anyhow. A couple of weeks ago, we celebrated, as we like to say, what is always a very sad and difficult holiday weekend for me. That's Memorial Day, on which we honor those who have died in defense of our country and our freedom. Familiar to relatively few and never known by most, the Battle of Okinawa is full of superlatives. It was the largest battle of World War II. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. It was the most furious use by the Imperial Japanese of kamikaze air attacks, far more than the earlier one at Leyte. It was the widest use of children by the Imperial Japanese as sappers, that is, as bomb carriers. It was the largest loss ever experienced by the U.S. Navy in terms of ships and personnel in U.S. history. It was the largest incidence of battle fatigue, what we used to call shell shock. Now we call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. The largest incident of battle fatigue in U.S. history. It also resulted in a KIA killed in action of the highest-ranking U.S. general killed in World War II, Lieutenant General Simon Buckner. He's the fellow on the left. I always found it curious that his dad, Simon Buckner Sr., also a West Point graduate, was an officer in the Civil War and still alive while his son served in the Pacific and died. Those two wars weren't that far apart. Also, the most popular World War II journalist, Ernie Pyle, was also KIA on Okinawa. It was the last battle of World War II. It was, I think, cited commonly and I think persuasively as the most influential event in President Truman's decision to use atomic bombs in Japan. Both we and our children know virtually nothing about it. As a result, we know relatively little, if anything, about the horrible effects on the people who were there and what it should teach us about what we are doing now. There are movie portrayals. You may have seen the Hacksaw Ridge movie, directed by Clint Eastwood in 2016. It's about the Battle of Okinawa and about the 77th Infantry Division, the unit my father served in on Okinawa, and a particular soldier by the name of Desmond Doss, who was an Army medic. For movies, that's always an appealing character, particularly when it's one who says he's not going to carry a rifle or fire a weapon, although I can tell you that Medic Doss repeatedly said in his public appearances that far more American lives were saved by marksmanship than by him. And he understood that and appreciated that. But reality did suffer. For instance, if you look on the left-hand side, that's what Hacksaw Ridge looks like in the movie. In reality, it looks like what it is on the right-hand side. Visually not quite as attractive, not as easy to show the troops. They did use some cargo nets and ladders to get up it. It's about a 70-degree slope, not a 90-degree slope like it was in the movie. But again, movies are entertainment. They're not history, and they certainly are not going to portray combat in really realistic terms. I think the most important thing about that movie, when you watch it, if you do again, keep this in mind. It's about them going up the first day and being annihilated by the Japanese, with Doss staying there into the night, saving many, many soldiers. But to me, the most significant part of the movie is the same soldiers that survived went up that ridge the next day, too, even though they had already been there through the first day. And the second day, they won the battle. But tonight, this is not about movies. Okinawa was an island on which many people fought and many people died. What I have done is tried to pull together some research on my own, some military records, many of which were not available, of course, until after the war was over, sometimes long over, and also recollections of discussions that I had with my father and with some of his combat buddies who were curiously from the same community that we lived in Pennsylvania. Our family social clubs were the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And of course, these people never talked about themselves, about what happened in combat, but they would occasionally talk about what their buddies did. Operation Iceberg, bigger than D-Day. Why Okinawa? Well, principally because it's about 350 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost major island of Japan. That puts it within range of heavy bombers, including B-29s, to support the Allied effort to invade and occupy Japan, of course, the ultimate objective of the Pacific War. It's only about 464 square miles, probably about 80% of the size of Kalamazoo County. It's 66 miles from north to south, never more than 20 miles wide. Mostly rocky, subtropical, humid, coral rocks, limestone, eroded over the many, many years into hundreds of caves, which you'll hear more about. It was a former separate nation controlled by the Chinese. The language and customs, therefore, are much different than the Japanese, and Imperial Japan held Okinawans in very low esteem. The battle plan map, this is one published in April of 1945. Of course, it's in representative relief, not revealing any details about the plan. But it did point out the nearness of Okinawa to the main Japanese islands. It pointed out a couple airfields in the southernmost tip of the island. Interestingly enough, the inset covers up Ai Shima, which is another island located to the northwest. This is actually the American invasion routes to Okinawa. The ultimate objective of everybody on the main parts of the island was the Shuri Line, which was the main defense of Imperial Japan, protecting those two airfields that were down at the bottom. But receiving very little publicity at the time was Ai Shima. My father's unit were there first on the beach, and it contained a large flat plateau. They seized that island in about 8 days. This is a battle that lasted 89 days in total, but in about 8 days, and on the 9th day, the engineers arrived and started building runways on Ai Shima. It could accommodate two 6,000-foot runways, and it was from Ai Shima that most of the B-29s were going to be launched towards Japan. It was really a very, very important part of the objective. The U.S. had committed 250,000 combat troops, that's 15 divisions, 261 ships, sorry I'm going to bore you with some numbers here, hundreds of troop carriers, of which 36 large ships were sunk, 368 were damaged. Navy had 4,900 KIA, largest in naval history. Imperial Japan had 76,000 troops on Okinawa, plus another 40,000 Okinawans who were conscripted and put in Imperial Japanese uniforms. The casualties and deaths were enormous. These are now a memorial on Okinawa that lists every single person known to have died there. It takes up a whole public park. And that's because the casualties were enormous. The military casualties numbered at least 200,000, civilian casualties 150,000, approximately half the civilian population of Okinawa. And of those that survived, half of them were wounded. Before the battle, it was predicted that the U.S. casualties would be 80%. They turned out to be 70%, which is a huge number in terms of military effectiveness. Some 82,000 with 14,000 casualties, 12,000, some 100 KIA, another 7,700 died after the battle, and that doesn't count the indirect deaths, frankly, like my father's, that happened 20 years later. Oh, one of the reasons for the casualties is this. This is the battleship Wisconsin firing 16-inch guns. Each one of those 16-inch shells is about the size and weight of a Volkswagen Beetle. And a series of American ships did that for some 90 days before any U.S. troop hit the shore at Okinawa. The Japanese diaries refer to it as the typhoon of steel. But the result was very rewarding. The military assessments afterwards say that it exceeded all hope and expectation. It provided a fleet anchorage, troop staging areas, and airfields in sufficient proximity to Japan that the invasion force could be based there, and that was the whole objective of going there. From late January to March 26th of 1945, this is what happened. The length of the battle was a total of, official battle dates are 98 days from March 26 to July 2 of 1945. By the way, the battle was predicted was going to last 28 days. And why? Because the Imperial Japanese resistance was so strong. It was later discovered that the high command of the Japanese had already concluded the war was lost. General Yamamoto told them long before this that if we're going to bomb Pearl Harbor, we have to win within 90 to 120 days. If we don't, then the United States will raise its power. He had been 2 years at Harvard. He'd served 2 years as the military attaché to the Japanese embassy in Washington. He knew America. And he said, you've got to win right away. If you don't win right away, you're going to lose. Because America is so powerful and so committed, and their will is so strong that we will be defeated. So by 1945, even the high command of Imperial Japan agreed with that. They were looking for a way to make battles so expensive for the Allies, particularly in terms of blood, that possibly the public support for the war would erode, and there would be a willingness to negotiate some sort of peace which would allow Imperial Japan to retain some of its conquered territories. That is why they enlisted some 40,000 of the Okinawan population to be put into uniform. Their military code, which we now commonly refer to as Bushido, it came in several different variations. Basically, the theme was honor is only through death. So you fought as long as you could, and if you could not win and you hadn't already been killed, you committed suicide. And that is why on Okinawa, the numbers were so enormous. The civilian population was co-opted not only to be conscripts in uniform, but the civilian population, particularly as the battle went on into the second and third month, was enlisted to do tasks not only like gathering food or giving first aid to Imperial Japanese troops, but also, as I said, to act as sappers, having explosives, carry them into American lines. To give you some idea of the problems the U.S. troops were dealing with, this is what a hillside, typical hillside, looked like from the point of view of the U.S. troops going at it. This is what it looked like from the other side, the one on the left-hand side of the photo. You can see it's pockmarked with caves into which artillery could be put, rolled out when necessary, then rolled back in and be virtually immune from U.S. air attack. It is also not noted often, but Okinawa, being poorly regarded by the Japanese, was used for decades by the Japanese military to train its artillery and mortar crews, so that virtually every square meter of the island was already zeroed in. All they needed was the map coordinates, and they already knew how to drop a shell right on it. And most of the casualties that were incurred by the Allies there, as well as the KIAs, were incurred by artillery. General Buckner was killed by artillery. This was also the largest use of kamikazes, or suicide pilots. By this time in 1945, many of these were pilots virtually untrained, very youthful, but fairly effective. About between 2,000 and 3,000 kamikaze airplanes participated in the Battle of Okinawa. They had a hit ratio of about 1 to 9, which is not bad considering a fairly amateur pilot. And it's the main reason why the Navy incurred all those heavy losses, because the Japanese Navy was not functioning very well by this point. As an example, from April 4 to May 26, that's 30 days, U.S. forces in the southern tip of near that Shima line advanced 4 miles in 30 days. And it took them another 25 days to cover the remaining 10 miles to get to the tip of the island. The official history of my father's division, the 77th, says they spent 32 days going 3,500 yards. That's about 1 football field a day, and each of them were long days. The Japanese also, as I said, made heavy use of civilians. not only as human shields, but women and children as sappers. In fact, there's a lot of the after-action reports record that when they go out on the battlefield and view the dead, many of them are women armed only with spears. You can see in this picture the age of some of the Japanese conscripted soldiers. That's a U.S. soldier interrogating two who were captured. But there weren't that many POWs because most of them that weren't killed committed suicide. And that includes the civilians too. Of course, the women and children armed as sappers were sufficient danger to the American troops that they had to be shot. They had to be killed. And they were in large numbers. And the soldiers who did that carried that with them forever. The weather was also not helpful. After about 2 months, the plum rains arrived in late May, made vehicle movement virtually impossible because of the mud. One report describes it as a vast field of mud, lead, decay, and maggots. The battlefield conditions were described as similar to that of World War I, where the wet and muddy conditions caused a dead body to fall below the surface of the ground and to disappear, except for certain traces of it, smell and otherwise. And even now they are recovering bodies on the island of Okinawa that they haven't recovered before. Also a reason why a lot of the numbers probably are not accurate. I mentioned battle fatigue, and certainly those battlefield conditions that I just mentioned contributed greatly to that. Why is Okinawa not well known? Well, 98 days of battle. Well, before it even happened, news of war in the Pacific began to be suppressed by the government because the Battle of Iwo Jima that we hear so much about now and we glorify so much now and represents the statue at Arlington Cemetery of the Marines raising the flag was really received very badly by the public in the United States. There had been over 7,000 KIA on that island battle. And it was not popular. In fact, if you've ever watched Flags of Our Fathers, again, a very heavily sanitized movie by Clint Eastwood, but if you watch it, a lot of it's about the soldiers that raised, the Marines that raised the flag and how they were taken on bond tours afterwards to try to improve the public morale. Because number one, the country was running out of money, and number two, people were really getting sick and tired of the war. Americans like short wars, not long ones. Also on March 9th and 10th, that's about a month before the battle, there was the firebombing of Tokyo that I'll talk more about in just a second. But also not a very popular event and a devastating event in terms of the implications it drew towards what would happen during the invasion of Japan. After the battle began on March 5th, just 4 days after the Battle of Okinawa started, Russia declared war on Japan and said, we're coming to invade you too. On April 12, FDR died, and so the country went through the funeral and all of that proceeding. And on May 18th, almost 2 months before Okinawa ended, it's VE Day. The Nazis surrendered. There were celebrations all over Europe. New York City, the sailor kissing the girl in Times Square, all those things. Okinawa was not something they wanted to talk about very much. This is the shoulder patch of the 77th Division in which my father served. It's called the Statue of Liberty Division because it was formed in New York City and was one of the first divisions, that's about 15,000 troops, formed entirely of draftees. That meant they knew each other and their families because a lot of them came from the same communities throughout the Northeast and the Eastern US. A mistake which the Israelis also made when they began to raise their armies in the 60s and 70s, and which they don't make anymore, because they find that when the people in the same unit know one another and their families too well, the casualty rate as low as 15 or 20% can make the entire unit combat ineffective. They aren't capable of carrying on combat anymore. We would probably call it post-traumatic stress, but I don't know what you call it, but I'm just telling you it's a fact that it works that way. It also might be a problem regarding our current use of reserve troops and National Guard troops, all of whom are usually from the same general community. They know one another very well, sometimes having spent not just 9 weeks of training together, but years together. They're a lot cheaper to use than regular Army units, but whether they would be as combat and effective, one does not know. They've performed pretty well so far in their tours over in the Middle East, but it's something to think about. The 77th, after training in Hawaii, were in battles in Guam, Tinian, Saipan, Palu, Yap, Reforma Reto, then went to Ai, on to Okinawa. After Okinawa, they went down to Cebu, mostly to take care of Japanese prisoners, of whom there weren't very many. Because they were depleted by 70%, they were scheduled to go to Australia, but when they got partway there, they got turned around and headed back up to Japan to get ready for the invasion. They were mostly new replacements. In combat, rookies die faster. Experience is what keeps you alive. And the plan for the invasion of Japan showed that. This is a good military map, by the way. The good guys are in blue and the bad guys are in red, all right? That's the way this depicts. That's the way all military maps are done. What's interesting, though, is the 77th Division is here, and it's marked diversion force. When you're planning a battle, you don't want to be in the diversion force, trust me, because the objective there is to land that division on that island. There's the main islands, there's Hokkaido, there's Kyushu down there, there's the main islands of Japan. And once they land there and draw the Japanese army towards that location, thinking it might be the beginning of the main invasion, you leave them there. And the main invasion force comes in from the south and also around Tokyo Bay, which really were the only two places to perform a decent amphibious operation in the islands of Japan. It's pretty rocky shore. But at any rate, had they gone through with the invasion, a very good chance that my father and virtually all of his comrades would not have survived. But when you're doing things like planning military operations, sometimes they have a term for it. This is one of the official maps for the plan for the invasion, and they were labeled diversion force. Now, needless to say, you don't tell the troops at the time about that, but sometimes you have to plan that way. The DoD predictions for the invasion of Japan were based largely on the Battle of Okinawa, with extrapolations made. Many of them were horrendously inaccurate, but nevertheless they were based on them. They thought it would take 54 US divisions, that's about 6 million people. Japan prepared, by the way, not for 54 divisions, but for 90. So they were ready. 42 carriers, 24 battleships, 400 destroyers, about 500 ships, plus countless troop carriers. 3 air forces, 5th, 7th, and 13th. They estimated there was 300,000 to 545,000 enemy on Kyushu, which is where the main invasion force would go. In reality, there was 900,000, they found out after the war. And of course, part of the plan is not if people die, but planning for how many. Secretary of War Stimson was given what I think is one of the best reports. Of course, nobody knew about this publicly until long after the war. Done by a fellow named William Shockley, whose name may be familiar to some of you, who was very prominent in this intelligence area. They predicted 1.7 million US casualties. That's KIA and wounded in action sufficiently that they could no longer participate in combat. They predicted the Japanese casualties at between 5 and 10 million. If the same tactics used here were used as were used on Okinawa. We know now the Imperial Japanese Defense Plan was translated from the Japanese by people with more knowledge of it than I have. The glorious death of 100 million. The DoD plan also predicted that 1/2 of the US force would be destroyed before it hit the beach, in large part due to kamikazes and also emplaced artillery. The US estimate was there'd be 8,000 kamikazes. In reality, there was almost 13,000. And again, that's one of the reasons why so many naval ships were lost. Chemicals were rejected as an anti-personnel weapon, even though proposed to President Truman. He did authorize them, though, for use against crops, to deprive foodstuffs, and to introduce starvation of the Japanese population as an additional element of the invasion. In fact, the chemical that was authorized is a precursor of the Agent Orange that we talk about from Vietnam, basically the same stuff. They didn't want to use it against personnel because there was a fear of retaliation by the Japanese. Even then, what we now call weapons of mass destruction were considered in a separate category from conventional and other weapons, and it was considered likely that if you used chemicals against enemy forces, they would use chemicals against your forces. And that same principle holds true in the protocols we teach that I was taught 50 years ago as an Army officer, and that is we don't have, the WMDs are in a triad. It's chemical, biological, and nuclear. We don't have chemical or biological. We agreed to get rid of them. We destroyed them. We don't have people that know how to make them or use them. All we have is nuclear left. So if somebody uses chemicals against our troops, our likely response is to use tactical nuclear weapons. And when I was trained as an infantry officer half a century ago, every tactical problem we did, we had to figure 2 solutions. Take that hill, one with conventional weapons, one with tactical nuclear weapons. And even without computers, we had to do little calculations about whether we wanted 1/10 of a kiloton or 2/10 of a kiloton. Lord knows what they're able to do now. Purple Heart preparations for the invasion of Japan, they actually manufactured 500,000 before the invasion was called off. And there's still 120,000 of those left. They're still using them. It's enabled them over in Afghanistan now and Iraq and some of those places that if a person's injured, they get a Purple Heart right in the hospital bed because there's lots of them around. Obviously, this sort of analysis led to a decision to use atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that also was heavily influenced by, well, first of all, they didn't use them on Okinawa because the first blast wasn't tested in New Mexico until later in July of '45. But also, they knew from March 9th that the logical alternative, as General Curtis LeMay was fond of saying, was to bomb them back to the Stone Age. And in the firebombing of Tokyo on one evening of March 9, about 200,000 people died. And that was using conventional bombers and, quote, conventional, unquote, bombs. And actually, they were high explosive napalm-like substance, jelly gasoline. Almost 1 million people were wounded. Many more than 1 million were made homeless. And that would have been the fate of every Japanese city. Japan surrendered on September 2. Let me talk now about some effects on the soldiers. These are purely anecdotal. As I mentioned, the 77th Division had a total formation time of 4 years from the beginning of the war to the end. It had 200 plus battle days. That's when somebody's actually shooting at you. They'd traveled 25,000 miles. They had 2,000 KIAs. They had about 6,300 wounded in action. No accounting for the people that died later on, like my father. And they were 90 days at sea within range of Japanese submarines and kamikaze. They accounted for 43,000 enemy dead, plus or minus a few thousand. Sometimes the counts aren't very accurate in that regard. and throughout that entire period took only 488 prisoners of war. The kill ratio was 22 to 1. Military people calculate stuff like that. The casualty ratio was 5 to 1. That's a great performance by a combat unit. But of course, no accounting for civilian dead or injured, or virtually none. Military people don't pay much attention to that in terms of their numbers. That's collateral damage, and it happens. Even though our protocols require us to minimize those civilian casualties, they're not the sort of things that go into the major parts of the plan. This is a shadow box that I made up. My father would never share these things with me, but these are some of his decorations and insignia from the war. He was a military policeman, although when I first asked him what his MP armband meant, he said motor pool. Because before the war, he owned a trucking company, before he got drafted. And he was good with vehicles. He knew how to fix them. He knew how to keep them running. He and his buddies even figured out a way to run a truck underwater completely for a short distance when they were putting them on the beach. This up here is a dog tag. You may have heard about that. Contrary to popular belief, the notch in it was not used to put in people's teeth. You actually had two. I had two when I was in, one on a short chain, one on a long chain. And if you were wounded or killed, the one on the short chain was taken off and used as a toe tag, essentially, and taped to your foot. But it had your blood type on it, had your serial number, had your name, and back in this day, it had your religion on it, too. My father died June 1, 1965, at age 55. He'd been drafted at age 33 in 1942. Pretty old for a drafted soldier in those days. And he died of service-connected wounds and diseases from World War II. That was the day before my high school graduation. That's a Japanese Harikari knife, a suicide knife. And I remember one of his friends at the American Legion telling me that there were rivers of blood flowing down the hills from the temples on Hokkaido when they went in for the occupation because of the number of suicides that were done by both Japanese civilians and by Japanese military. These are battle ribbons. This is part of that fruit salad that you see soldiers wear above their left pocket when they're in formal uniform. They do that because it tells people where they've been and what they've done. And to another soldier, it says a great deal without saying anything. The bronze stars that are on here represent battles. On that Philippine campaign, it actually represents 3 battles. One of these is Okinawa. That arrowhead means first on the beach. That's at Hiroshima. That's the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. All right? Those are the people that are there before anybody else is. This is a combat infantryman badge. If you see anybody wearing one of these and on their darker uniforms, sometimes it'll be just a dark shadow of that same image. But it's a rectangular field with a flintlock rifle and a wreath around it. A CIB, a combat infantry badge, is worn only by somebody who's really been in the stuff. My view is, if they have one of those, all the rest of this stuff is details. All right? They have been there. This is a photo of my father and a friend of his on Hokkaido during the occupation. Fraternizing with Japanese civilians, including children, was a court-martial offense. But these people had been at Guam and Saipan and Leyte and Okinawa, and frankly, they didn't give a damn. They did pretty much what they wanted to do. And it could be that caring for the children is something that American troops are always famous for. It may have been a hangover from some of the events on Okinawa, too. On Hokkaido, The 77th Division was assigned to the northernmost Japanese main island, in part because the Soviets had threatened to invade there. They wanted the northern half of the island. Hadn't been decided they wouldn't do that yet. And so, guess who was going to be the diversion force for the Soviet invasion? Right? 77th, okay? Because again, it was still 70% new people. What I know about the vets from talking to them and my own recollections, they believe in God. They do what's right just because it's right, whether it's good for them or not. My own conclusion is that once people decide they're willing to die for somebody else, a lot of other decisions get a lot easier. They don't talk about combat, and please don't ask them. If they want to talk about it, they'll let you know, but usually they don't. They'll talk to their friends or somebody else about it. They went to work every day. They consumed enormous amounts of alcohol, sometimes way too much. They almost all had tattoos, particularly on their arms and legs. Part of that may have been a excessive activity from being on leave with too much alcohol one night, but there was also a practical reason for it, and that is back in those days, you had to be classified KIA in order to collect your serviceman's group life insurance, which was $10,000 during World War II. That's like $100,000 today. But in order to be KIA, they had to have an identifiable body part, no DNA. And so it was important for the soldiers to make it more likely that you could find a body part with a. My father had his initials on both his shoulders. They liked guns, favored guns. I probably had my first rifle at 22 long with a scope on it when I was 10, closely supervised by my father and my uncle, particularly about gun safety, but they were great believers in saying that more accurate shooters live longer, and so do their friends. Duty, honor, country, but most importantly, a fierce loyalty to their buddies, to an irrational extent. An ethnic hatred of the Japanese was common among them. When Japanese cars, I remember Japanese cars started to arrive in America in the late 50s, early 60s, my father and his friends were just aghast that anybody would buy one. Couldn't figure that out. They all had scars, they had wounds, they had burns, I saw them. Very few Purple Hearts, which is given for a combat injury. And I remember asking one of his friends this, why don't you have a Purple Heart? Because you got all these bad scars. And he said, well, I said, you know, the medics used to tell us to go to the aid station because we'd get a Purple Heart, but you go there and there were guys without arms and without legs and a lot of dead people. I said, you just didn't feel right to be asking for a medal. The untold story, I think, are the diseases they all had. Uncurable tropical dysentery in an age before antibiotics, a little bit of penicillin, a couple other mild infection treatments, but nothing compared to what's happening now. Malaria, recurrent. The expense of veterans care, drugs. My father, every couple of weeks, would get a little brown envelope from the Veterans Administration in which there was a pill bottle inside. There'd be more things for him to take. And it could be they were the beginning of antibiotics. Most of his records, like most of the records of these people that served back then, were destroyed in a big Army record center fire down in St. Louis back in the 50s. So a lot of those records are just not obtainable anymore. But I do know he had more than a dozen surgeries, mostly to take out pieces of them that they couldn't get the infection controlled. Sick every day. When he had malaria, he would repeat the phrase, the words, shiny boots, shiny boots, shiny boots. I again asked at one point in time one of his friends what that was about. And he said, that's about Okinawa. He said, as the battle went on, the young lieutenants came in the morning, and they would go out on the gurneys and stretchers at night and they were so new, their boots were still shiny. Young lieutenants don't last long in combat. All right, that's a tough job. At any rate, some topics for discussion. Rather somber. Let's see if we can fire this up a little bit. History can be a good teacher. It should be debated, preferably with original sources, but it's okay to use books and movies and stuff like that to spur our interest in it. It can't be erased or canceled, though. It just can't. It won't allow that to happen. In fact, in my view, the more history offends us, probably the better it is that we're aware of it, because it makes it less likely that we're going to make that same mistake over again. The costs of war, much greater than the military numbers, much, much greater. Much greater than the expenses or the casualty counts. The civilian casualties, as I say, are virtually always left out. You never hear about them. War is constant. Happens every day in the world. Happens most days involving the United States. Somewhere. Pretending it will not occur is probably a fantasy. Therefore, we have to think how to do it when we have to. I would suggest everyone sign up and take Military Science 101 and 102. Those are the basic ROTC courses up at Western. They're filled with military history. They'll tell you the basics about strategy and tactics. They'll tell you the basics of U.S. protocols in fighting a war. Very helpful in trying to read the news and understand what is going on and why, not only here but elsewhere. Every combat soldier is wounded, not just with visible wounds, but with diseases and mental. Short is better than long when it comes to war. Every time we get ready for one of these new excursions somewhere, I always call up my good friend Fred Upton. I send him $10 and say, Fred, take a cab ride down to that long black wall and spend 30 minutes walking down the sidewalk. And then when you're done, if you're willing to back our folks with every weapon we have, and I mean every weapon we have, in terms of support, then maybe go ahead and do it. But if you aren't going to do that, just stay home. Thank you very much for your patience tonight.
Ask some questions. I'd like to ask the first question is, every bit of history like this has revisionists. And there must have been a lot of revisionist history about the battle plan and the toll that it took and whether it was necessary. The toll was that great that it could have been accomplished differently.
Well, what I like to do is look at primary sources. Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was trained as an analytical historian in Ann Arbor by a wonderful professor. Back in those days, before the computer, the requirement for your thesis was you had to exhaust every available resource on your topic. So you tended to make a narrow topic and then exhaust it. I like to do, and now the great thing about the internet is everything's available. I mean, practically everything, including a lot of stuff which, as I said, was not revealed until many, many years after the war. But if you go in and look at the after-action reports of the soldiers, if you look at the Department of Defense papers, which have not been doctored, they really haven't. I mean, it's the real one that was there on that date. They can be quite revealing. Do people want to portray it a different way? Sure they do. Read about the Battle of Okinawa written by an Okinawan, and I'll bet it comes out a lot different than it does with an American writing it.
Anybody else here? Questions? No? All right, thank you very much, John. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. Barbara, can you tell us about what we're going to be talking about next month?
Next month, which is not a normal torch month, but I hope you all can make it. My husband, Jim, will be talking about his 500-mile journey across northern Spain in the Camino de Compostela. And he's excited to speak with you, and I think you'll be enjoying it too.
Thank you. Okay, enjoy everything. Thank you very much, John, again. And I guess that's it. Say good night. Okay?